We have filters in cars now that, they just started putting in 15 years ago. We have cars that have filters that you would normally change every 15,000 miles or once a year. They don't even have them anymore. So let's just go through the rundown. You want to do that, Dave? I mean, you got an oil filter.
Let me go the one that everybody recognizes, the old air filter, okay? You stop by the XYZ tire shop, you're getting an oil change, and guess what? Some young kid's going to run up with an air filter in his hands and going to say, "Oh, look how dirty that is. You need one of those." So that's the air filter for the engine. So the engine ingests air for combustion, and it's got to run it through a filter. And that filter is super important, but that's the first one that people get recommended. So I think that's the one that everybody relates to is the air filter. That's just one of a handful of filters that are on your car.
Right.
So the air filter is probably one you can all relate to. Matt, how often do you need an air filter?
Well, I mean, the conditions depend. It depends on where you drive, how you drive. I mean, if you're working on the ranch, so to speak, or you go out to the sand dunes a lot and you're hauling and going off road and stuff, you probably need one more often. But typically speaking, we're talking to people who are commuting to work, driving around town, using their car in the metropolitan area. It's once a year.
Average Joe or average Judy.
Yeah.
Okay.
Just like us, just average dudes driving around. It's once a year to change it. Not to check it.
Well, this brings me to a vehicle that I had in my shop this week. And this lady comes to my shop. She was in another auto repair shop. She's got some crazy noise in her car. She's a Jeep Patriot. I think it was maybe probably a 14. About 37,000 miles on it. And when it hit a certain RPM, it would make this crazy noise. And so she went over to the other shop. They looked at it, and they said, "We think the mounts might be bad. It's only got 37,000 miles on it, but you know what? It kind of sounds weird enough. We want you to go over to Tri-City Transmission because maybe you have a transmission type issue. Let's see what they think about it." Well, she brought it over to us, and I jumped in the car and went for a drive with her, and I drove it with her for 15 minutes before I made this noise happen, and it was a weird little noise. And she goes, "There it is, right there." I go, "That's weird." I go, "This one's going to be interesting to find." So I dropped her off at her house, went back. John and I jumped in the car, and we drove this car. And literally, it probably took us 3 hours to figure out what this was. And what we found was on the air box where the air filter lives, when she was into the prior tire shop, when they did the oil change, they checked her air filter. Well, they left a couple of screws loose.
Right.
So it was not only sucking air at weird times, it was bypassing the filter, so just sucking in unfiltered air, which is not good for your engine. It was also rattling. And on some of those Chryslers, they put the computer right on top of the air box. So it's kind of an integrated thing. And so basically what we had to do is they stripped out a couple holes. They left a couple of screws loose. We had to find some oversized screws and move some things around. We were able to fix it for her. And at the end of the day, she came in with this big eyeballs like, "I'm going to need a transmission." And she left with, it was a $98 charge to find some loose screws.
And you gave her a gift, too. People would think, if you really charged for the time that you had to
it would have cost way more than that.
You would have been a rip, But that gets back to, the story's a little bit about checking the air filter, but it's a lot about how we got to the point where it became a problem. So, and maybe it was the guys at the tire shop that didn't put the box on right, or maybe they left the screw out because the guy before them broke it and left the screw out, so they just returned it to the way it was. But this kind of goes back to being an orphan customer. What I said in the beginning is you don't have to check that air filter every time.
No.
First off, a lot of these things are a real pain in the butt to change.
Mm-hmm.
Let's wait till we need to have Jason, our tribologist oil guy, come in and talk about how much just a little bit of dirt getting past the air filter, how that can really get into the oil and affect the oil.
Yep.
I didn't believe it until he really showed me the data, the facts.
Under a microscope, yeah. It's a big deal.
Big time big deal. And then, so if you're an orphan, nobody ever knows the history of that air filter, and you probably don't either. But if you come to our shops on a regular basis, we know your service history. So we're not going to take that air filter box. I mean, you can only bend a paper clip so many times. Mm-hmm. And it breaks. And there's a lot of things on these air filter boxes that's not just the air filter box, but then there's a snorkel that connects it to maybe the mass airflow sensor.
These things are plastic, and there's clips, and they're not exactly your Breville juice maker. I mean, they're just kind of junky.
Yeah.
And so what happens is
cheap.
They're not cheap, and there's a seal there, and every time you disturb that seal, all that dust and crap. You know, when you change the air filter at home in your house, dust and crap gets around. Well, some of that gets into the air box, which gets in the engine. So here's my deal, and I'm just going to take it. If you're average Joe or average Judy, okay, you're not going through the Baja, then just change it once a year. Don't, I would just almost put a sticker right on top of my airbags that says, don't check filter.
Yeah, exactly.
Because you don't need to check it. Just change it once a year and you'll be fine, because every time you rupture that, you do a little something to it.
Well, Dave, and I had a gentleman the other day, I said, and we checked his air filter, and he was a first-time customer, and I said, you don't really need it now. He says, well, can you just bang all the dust out? And I said, no. He says, whoa, why not? I said, no, that's worse. When you're banging that or wrapping it against your hand or banging it on the curb, you're just embedding those particles deeper into the filter, which more possibly allows them to pass through the filter. So if you're doing this at home, if you're the guy that changes your oil and changes your filter, don't knock it on the ground and clean it out. You're doing yourself a disservice. And the other thing you need to do, a lot of the car's sucking in air, it hits the filter gets dirty, but then the big stuff drops. You've got to vacuum that air box out too. Don't just put a new filter in it. Mm-hmm. You got to clean that out.
Well, and if you're doing it at home, changing your air filter for your AC, you're kind of doing the same thing. You're cleaning off the vents, you're wiping it out, you're doing all that stuff. That's the way it should be done, but that's not happening at Joe Jiffy Lube down there.
Right.
They're just you got a young kid in there working, and I tell you what, you almost got to have a degree from MIT to get some of these air boxes back together.
Yeah. And the engineers that designed them forgot that we're not engineers.
Yeah, and then Jimmy on the spot here is trying to get back together, and he doesn't have all those tricks that a guy's been doing it for 20 years.
He's got to hurry up because the next one's out there waiting in line.
That's true.
Well, let's talk about some other filters. So I was going to start with the oil filter. Duh, that's the most obvious. We're changing that every time we get an oil change. 5,000 miles is pretty much the most popular oil change right now. You're getting a filter when you do that. Cabin air filter, Dave, same thing. It's a lot like the engine air filter. It's pretty much once a year.
It's a once-a-year deal. Some people don't know they have one, and what happens, and this is a big thing, you're driving around, your air condition feels wimpy, and you haven't got a cabin air filter in 2 years. Go buy one, and you'll be impressed because the airspeed comes up because it's been slowing down as that filter's been getting dirtier. And airspeed is what makes you feel cool. Change out that cabin filter, be like, man, I just turbocharged my AC.
That's right. Well, and then let's break down the cabin air filters a little bit. There's going to be some times that change. My shop's in the central Phoenix area. Not a lot of houses down there have garages. A lot of carports, and they have the little Palo Verde trees. So when you open your hood, when you go to the car wash next time, before you go, open the hood and look at the base of the windshield where the windshield wipers are and get all the leaves and that junk out of there, because that's getting sucked in to the cabin air filter. So if you don't have a garage or you go to work and you want to go find the shady spot under the tree, you might need your cabin air filter a little more often. And now not only are the cabin air filters, it's just a paper element, but now they have them charcoal activated. So for those that are sensitive to perfumes and other odors, because remember, we're filtering dirt and debris, but we're also at times filtering the outside air. So that if you're a person that's sensitive to allergies, and we'll ask you that, if there's a carbon filter available for your cabin, we'll put one of those in. Do you have your dog in the car a lot? These are some of the times where you might need to do your filter a little bit more often. So the environmental conditions are what dictate a lot of this. And Dave, we've got to get to,
let's talk about fuel filters, because that one's changed, right? That's a huge one that's changed, is that everyone remembers their fuel filter. You got one every every 30,000 miles. Mm-hmm. They just don't even put them on the car anymore. There's no fuel filters. So if you're over at Acme and you got a late model car and they say you got to change your fuel filter, go, are you sure?
Well, and sometimes, or they're just built into the pump and they're part of the...
They get changed with the pump.
They get changed with the pump. It's like that lifetime transmission fluid. You just change it when you put the new